S374, Protecting Responsible Gun Sales Act of 2013, Senator Schumer's bill, and Senator Schumer, I yield to you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to consider this piece of legislation and the other important pieces of legislation you brought before this committee. The bill I've circulated today closely resembles the Fixed Gun Checks Act I introduced last Congress. I don't want to say too much about it at this point because the chairman has asked us to keep our statements short and because I am working on compromise legislation. The Fixed Gun Checks Act that I've circulated contains my ideal approach to expanding background checks to all gun sales, a concept over 90% of Americans support. However, it's not the only way to do it. I've been talking and am continuing to talk with colleagues across the political spectrum and across the aisle about a compromise approach, and I remain optimistic that we'll be able to roll one out. But we're not 100% there yet, so for the purposes of this committee's markup, I've circulated my own bill, while we finalize a bipartisan compromise. I have a longer statement about the bill that I'll put in the record with the chairman's permission, along with numerous letters of support. But for now, I'll just highlight that it does two critical things: help states get their records into the NICS database and require a background check before all private gun sales. I'd like to offer my amendment, ALB 13180, as a substitute.
The senator has a right to substitute. I would assume we accept the substitute, and then of course the bill would be open to, if there's no objection, we'll accept the substitute to his bill following the normal procedure, and then it would be open to amendment. And before I yield to Senator Grassley, I note we have Senator Reynolds, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Coons, Senator Franken, Senator Schumer, myself, Senator Grassley, Senator Hatch, and Senator Flake. So that amendment is accepted, and Senator Grassley.
Yeah. I want to speak about my objections to Senator Schumer's bill, and at the end of my statement, I've got 2 or 3 questions I'd like to ask Senator Schumer. I oppose the bill. The first point goes to process. When this bill was first listed on the committee agenda, it was just a listing of findings, so obviously it was not ready for markup then. The language is now changed, as the substitute implies. I don't think it's still not ready. It's still not ready for markup, but we're marking it up anyway. We were told that there was such a widespread support for universal background checks that a bipartisan bill would be on its inevitable way to passage. Instead, 3 of the 4 senators involved in those discussions do not endorse the bill that is now before us. I sense from Senator Schumer that he's hoping that that can still happen. The bill that we're on is somewhat similar to a bill that Senator Schumer introduced in the previous Congress. So let's start with the big picture problems that I find with it. First, as a witness stated at the hearings, there's no way to enforce a requirement of universal background checks without implementing a gun registration. I acknowledge Senator Schumer says that the federal law prevents such a registry, but federal law can be changed by federal law, and this would-be federal law requires the federal licensed dealer to keep a registration record of the transfer. Mass shootings would continue to occur despite universal background checks. Criminals will continue to steal guns and buy them illegally to circumvent the requirement. When that happens, we will be back again debating whether gun registration is needed, and when registration fails, the next move will be gun confiscation. In fact, the Deputy Director of the National Institute of Justice concluded earlier this year with respect to universal background checks that, quote, effectiveness depends on requiring gun registration, end of quote. He noted that the largest sources of how criminals obtain guns are through straw purchases and theft. He wrote that straw purchases and theft, quote, would likely become larger if background checks at gun shows and private sellers were addressed. This bill would unnecessarily burden private sales. I think it has unintended consequences. The law already requires background checks for sales by licensed dealers. We're told that criminals don't get guns because of current background checks. We're told that when they seek to purchase guns, background checks prevent them. But that is not the case. Obviously, criminals still get guns. They obtain them because they do not comply with background checks. Supporters of this bill contend that if we only make background checks universal, criminals will not get guns. But criminals do not comply with existing background check laws. Why? Why would anybody then think that they would comply, the criminal comply with broader background check requirements? They will be driven even more to straw purchases and theft, just as the National Institute of Justice official said. The effectiveness of this bill is therefore highly questionable. My next point, and this goes to the details of the bill, the mental health provisions from last Congress have been eliminated. That is a positive. We had Professor David Kopel, one of the hearing witnesses, pointed out the flaws in that language during the last Congress, but many other flaws remain. The bill greatly restricts the right of law-abiding citizens. The bill's family exception applies to gifts only. It does not permit lending a gun to a family member. The bill does not permit a temporary transfer in the home. So a gun owner cannot bring a new gun to a friend's house and let him handle it. If a gun owner and a friend return from a shooting range, then stop at the friend's house, the friend can't handle the owner's gun to show him how better to clean it, and an owner can transfer his gun to a friend at a licensed shooting range or while hunting, but if they go target shooting in the National Forest or on a friend's farm, the owner can't let the friend use his gun. Now, those are some of the problems. On top of that, gun safety instruction will be rendered impossible in many situations by this legislation. This training could occur at a target range, but many of these classes take place at schools, offices, sporting goods stores, and other locations. And then after those classes, only at the end does a class go to a shooting range for live fire instruction. So gun safety instructors could not offer the classroom component of the course anywhere except a shooting range or at the instructor's home. The most troublesome individual provisions of the bill is this requirement that a person whose gun is lost or stolen has to report it within 24 hours to local police and the U.S. Attorney General. The problem with this go way beyond the very short period of time that's allowed to report. For one thing, it would be a burden that applies only to lawful gun owners and not to the criminal. The law provides, quote, "It shall be unlawful for any person who lawfully possesses or owns a firearm to fail to report the theft or loss. It is a felony if a lawful gun owner fails to do so, but there's no requirement that a person who unlawfully owns a gun report his theft or loss. A felon who fails to report commits no crime. A law-abiding citizen who forgets commits a felony then. This provision poses a major threat to freedom because in America we prohibit criminal actions. Although that limits freedom, it does so much less than a law that criminalizes non-action. In America, it is very rare to criminalize inaction. Only a few classes of people have an obligation to act, police officers, doctors, but ordinary citizens do not have that requirement. One very limited exception is filing a tax return, and it took a constitutional amendment to give the government the power to mandate that. Requiring people to report lost or stolen guns is a good idea. Many, if not most, gun owners do so. But making it a federal offense not to take affirmative action is a legitimate question. I wonder what constitutional authority the Congress has to make people take an action such as this or face a criminal penalty. Maybe some of my colleagues would engage Senator Schumer on that point. Finally, I note the views of Mr. Mark Mattioli, once again, I quoted last week, and he's the father of a young son, James, who was murdered in Newtown. He states that he is, quote, not willing to entertain this conversation until Congress implements solutions to improve the NICS database. Until you fix the database and what feeds it, you will not solve anything, end of quote. He says that, quote, these checks are not universal and never will be. That word is intended to give people a sense that they have solved the entire problem, end of quote. Well, obviously I agree with the letter writer. We heard testimony that hundreds of thousands of mental health records of prohibited persons in a single state have not been provided to the NICS. We should make sure existing laws are effective and enforced before we start enacting new ones. For these reasons, I oppose this legislation. Now, as I said to Senator Schumer, I have 3 or 4 questions I'd like to ask him. I think they take short answers, so I'm not doing this to extend it out, but to get some clarification.